the fact that the king paid 4 times as much for a live captive as for a head created an incentive for the capture rather than the killing of enemies. Dalzel, it is true, claimed that, since many of those captured were sacrificed, slave gathering could not have been a source of profit to the king, but the statistics do not support him. Slaves were not, of course, gathered only for export, since, quite apart from those sacrificed, many were retained for use within Dahomey itself. The king distributed some of the captives in reward to his chiefs, and kept others for his own use. Of especial importance was the use of slave labor on the royal farms, which supported not only the king and his palace establishment but also the standing army, thus facilitating the professionalization of the military forces. The large-scale use of slave labor on the royal estates in Dahomey is already attested in the 1720s, and may well, since it is not reported in the earlier slave coast kingdoms, represent a Dahomean innovation. In Whydah earlier, it appears that the royal estates were cultivated rather by corves labor contributed by the chiefs. But the undeniable importance of slavery within the Dahomean domestic economy is quite compatible with the supposition that it was the growth of overseas demand for slaves which was the principal stimulus for the militarization of societies such as Dahomey. Another aspect of the link between warfare and commerce was of course the role of European firearms, which began to be imported in considerable numbers into the South Coast in the 1680s, to supplement and ultimately replace the javelins and bows which were the traditional missile weapons of the area. The effective use of firearms on the slave coast was probably pioneered by the Gold Coast mercenaries employed there. Certainly, the first war in which firearms are known to have played an important role was that in which a Fori, a refugee chief from a crow established at Little Popo, west of Great Popo, on the western South Coast and hired by the King of Whydah, attacked Whydah in 1692. The Dahomean tradition suggests that the Dahomans, despite their inland situation, had obtained firearms, presumably in exchange for slaves, before the end of the 17th century, and certainly by the 1720s they were in the forefront of arms technology, their forces being equipped exclusively with muskets and swords, and having abandoned the javelins and bows in use earlier. This adoption of firearms may well have some bearing upon the professionalization of Dahomean military organization, the creation of a regular army being designed to produce the superior standards of drill and discipline required for effective use of the new weapons. The counter-arguments of historians such as Fage and Ronan, stressing the non-commercial motivation of Dahomey's wars, do little more than reproduce the evidence of 18th century abolitionist writers, perhaps with sufficient critical attention to the polemical contest of their assertions. In fact, Dalzel's insistence on the absence of a commercial motivation in Dahomey's wars is somewhat undermined by his own account of the origins of the attack on Whydah in 1727, which follows Snellgrave in claiming that Agedja wished to secure access to supplies of imported European goods, especially of firearms. In this instance, of course, Dalzel felt obliged to defend Snellgrave's interpretation against the alternative view of John Atkins, attributing abolitionist objectives to Agedja, but other examples of the relevance of commercial motives to Dahomean military policy can be found in Dalzel's own account of the wars of King Pengra in the 1770s and 1780s. But even if we ignore these contradictions, and accept that the conscious motives of rulers in waging war were normally non-economic, this does not dispose of the issue, since the dominance of non-economic values encouraging war itself may have had economic causes. As Christopher Wrigley has pointed out, in response to Fage, war is a habit, an institution. War boys naturally believe in war, but the question remains, what brought the war boys to the fore? It is of limited sense to invoke Dahomean militarism as an explanation of Dahomey's aggressiveness, when it is precisely the historical origins of Dahomean militarism which are at issue. A more comprehensive critique of the tradition of seeing the Atlantic slave trade as the key to understanding Dahomean history has been offered more recently by Werner Peuckert, 1978. Although Peuckert's book deals with the second half of the 18th century, its conclusions clearly have implications for the earlier period also. Peuckert not only cites the customary evidence for the non-commercial motivation of Dahomey's wars, he also, and more importantly, adduces statistical evidence for the unimportance of the Atlantic trade. On Puchert's analysis, the Atlantic trade accounted for only a small proportion of national income in Dahomey and he suggests only 1/40th of the whole and an important proportion even of state revenues. The argument, however, is far from being conclusive. Its statistical basis is weak, involving problematical assumptions about Dahomey's population and agricultural output. An alternative calculation by Patrick Manning, 1982, would raise the share of the Atlantic trade in the national income to 15%, and both sets of figures must be regarded as having an essentially illustrative rather than a probative value. Assessment of the importance of the Atlantic trade must also, of course, be based upon qualitative as well as on quantitative considerations, and account needs to be taken of the crucial role played for the Dahomean state not only by imported firearms, whose importance Puchert tends to discount, but also by imported luxury items, which could be distributed to attract and secure the allegiance of followers, and by the cowrie shells which served as currency in local markets. The importance of imported goods in royal largesse was already clear in the 1720s, when Balfinchelin noted that the king of Dahomey gives Borges left square bracket cowries right square bracket like dirt, and brandy like water. The importance of cowrie shells should especially be stressed. In the second half of the 17th century, it appears that between a third and a half of the value of imports into the slave coast was normally in cowries. It is somewhat ironic that Puchert points to the existence of a flourishing local exchange economy in Dahomey, as part of his argument for the downgrading of the significance of overseas trade. But the flourishing local trade, lubricated by a currency of imported cowrie shells, was evidently, in large measure, itself a consequence of the booming Atlantic trade.